Breath of the Wild was a masterpiece of a game. It reaped in perfect scores from all over the internet, and I believe it is the best open world game ever made. It fixed many issues I had with your typical open world games of this generation. But the game isn't perfect, and has some problems just like every game does. And I'm here to discuss what can be dropped entirely, improved upon, stay, or come back from a previous game to create an even better Zelda experience and a better game in the next Zelda title. Nintendo has already said that the future of 3D Zelda will be built around the open air mechanic, so it's safe to say that a lot of the next game will be built around Breath of the Wild. Also, these are my opinions on what can make a better Zelda. If you don't agree, that's totally okay. Everyone has different tastes in games. First, I want to start with what aspects could be dropped in the next iteration. And one of the biggest flaws in Breath of the Wild, I think, was the voice acting. I wouldn't say it was bad.
Oh man, what am I gonna do?
Well, maybe some of it was. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure these voice actors are wonderful people and work very hard, but all the performances fell very flat for me. And why is Zelda the only person with an English accent? I always thought that was weird and out of place. Also, I can't be the only one who noticed Impa's voice sounded like a young person doing an impression of an old person. My whole problem with all the voices in the game was that they just never felt right or flowed naturally. In games like Uncharted or Wolfenstein, the voices sounded real. Like if I closed my eyes and forgot I was playing a video game, then they could be a person right next to me. If you're going to have voice acting in your game, then it must be pretty damn good. That's why Nolan North and Troy Baker are in almost every game. So I would be happy if they dropped voice acting in the next Zelda game. Unless they got Nolan North and Troy Baker. That would be sweet. The Divine Beasts were cool before we actually played them. And each one can be mechanically manipulated to different forms to solve puzzles or traverse the inside. That sounds amazing. Majora's Mask messed around with this gimmick a bit in the Stone Tower Temple, when you flip the entire temple upside down to get to the other areas of the dungeon. Or the infamous Water Temple in Ocarina of Time when you change the height of the water to get to higher or lower ledges. But sadly, once inside the Divine Beast, they were a bland and mostly boring dungeon, if you even want to call them dungeons. Each one looked the exact same on the inside. Besides the shape of the interior, nothing really separates one from another. They were all just ugly and empty. Something that separates Zelda from other games is their fascinating and wonderful dungeons. Every Zelda game has some intriguing dungeons to explore and solve, often being designed around a geographical area. Forest Temple is in the forest, Fire Temple is by a volcano, etc, etc. Now some people grew tired of this, but I never did. I always loved exploring and seeing what the superb designers at Nintendo could come up with. In the Divine Beasts, it's as if they just said, alright, let's put some brown shit on the walls, throw in a couple puzzles, generic boss battle, boom, there's your dungeon. Yes, there were some light elements that maybe separated them a little bit, but not by much. Yes, in Va Meadow you fly across to a terminal, and Va Ruta you had to shoot water from the trunk to solve a couple puzzles, but really that isn't enough to separate them all from each other. If the Divine Beasts were designed to actually stand out from one another and had some intriguing architecture, puzzles, and a fascinating boss, then that would be fantastic. But if they don't, they need to go. These aren't huge problems with the game, but some gripes that probably need to go as well. Rain. Rain was so damn annoying in Breath of the Wild. It happened way too much and would just make you wait to get up to an area. There were some areas of the game that rained constantly, and the terrain was designed around that, so that's fine. But other areas were not, and when it rained, it wasn't compelling, just annoying. Motion puzzles in Breath of the Wild were very annoying, especially if playing in handheld mode on the Switch. Once I solved it, I never felt satisfied, just once again annoyed and glad it was over with, so throw those right in the trash. Lack of boss variety. Just like dungeons, Zelda bosses are usually creative in some of the best aspects of the game. But, just like Divine Beasts, the bosses are very indistinguishable. They all look the same and are very generic. Zelda is known for having some of the best boss battles of all time, not these guys. Now, Breath of the Wild did have some overworld bosses just chilling out in the overworld, but we'll get to that later. The second subject I want to talk about is aspects that can be improved upon in the next iteration of Zelda, because everything can always be improved. Now, weapon durability was one of the major reasons why some people didn't enjoy the game as much as others. Personally, I loved it. The system made me try out weapons I normally wouldn't use. If my sword broke, then maybe I will pull out an axe that changes up how I go about taking down an enemy. But I did have some issues with it. Some weapons broke way too quickly, and there didn't seem to be that big of a variety of weapons. Hell, even the Master Sword broke at times. That was a bummer. The weapon durability system needs to stay, but they have to change up the weapon variety and how long they take to break. There were tons and tons of side quests in Breath of the Wild, the most in the entire series with 76, and many of them were just a total waste. Often just giving you rupees in return, because what else could they really give you? Shrines gave you orbs that could be used for heart containers or more stamina, and Korok seeds could be used for more storage room for weapons, bows, and shields. And the problem is that I was never really hurting for rupees after playing for the first couple of hours. Just through exploration you can find materials to sell for profit. So lack of rupees was never a problem, so I often never felt compelled to do a side quest. I'll be discussing this more later in the video, but there were some really fascinating side quests that I would put up there with Majora's Mask side quests. Maybe what you receive in return for completing it wasn't that great, but the experience of solving it was great. Take Misko the Great Bandit quest. You get a riddle that reads, "The little twin steps over the little river. My cave rests above that river source." So you open your map and notice two bridges named Big Twin and Little Twin. So you step over those bridges and you follow the river up to its source. Bomb a wall above the waterfall and boom, there's the treasure. How cool is that? Nobody said go here and do this and marked your map on exactly where to go. You were only given context clues and you had to solve the riddle yourself. Now imagine if most of those side quests were designed like this instead of some fetch quests. Or maybe you have some unique storyline or adventures you can go on like in Majora's Mask. If they do this in the next game, then side quests will sound a lot more compelling to me. It was pretty cool that you could just stumble upon a gigantic boss battle in Breath of the Wild. It added a little variety to the very lackluster variety of enemies, which I will get to in a sec. But just like the normal enemies, there are only a few of these guys as well. The Stone Talus, Hinox, and Mulduga. Yes, there are ones that are a little different, like the Frost Talus and the Stalnox, which is just a Hinox but skeleton form. But you defeat them in the exact same way, so they're practically the same. After running into the 6th Hinox, it's really not that interesting anymore. Wouldn't it be cool if some of the bosses were designed for the terrain it was in? Such as some tree-type monster near a wooded area, or a boss that utilizes wind to hurt you in a windy area? After battling these bosses so many times, I knew exactly what I was going to do every time I tried to defeat them. Part of the fun of boss battles is figuring out how to defeat that boss. I know this could sound a little nitpicky, but that's what this video is about. Solving all the problems to create the best Zelda game possible. How was this game so big and yet had such a small variety of enemies? I really liked how you would run into increasingly more difficult enemies farther into the game, but I could probably count all the different enemies on one hand. You got Bokoblins, Lizalfos, Moblins, Choo-Choos, Keys, Wizrobes, and Lynels. Well, there's really only 7 enemies you recurringly fight throughout the game, but still. And there are a couple others like the Guardians, but I won't count them because you rarely run into them. The combat never got boring, but it was a little depressing killing your 1000th Bokoblin. Hopefully in the next Zelda game there is a wider variety of different enemy types to fight. Next up, I want to talk about what needs to stay in the next Zelda game. What Breath of the Wild captured better than almost every game I've played was exploration. Rather than telling you exactly where to go, they let you explore at your own pace. Well, except for the main quests, but most of the game is absolute freedom. Hell, I just stumbled upon the Master Sword in my playthrough. Nobody said where it was, I just ran into it. Well, I have to admit, I had a feeling it would be in the Lost Woods because that's where it is in most Zelda games. But Breath of the Wild's exploration was its main hook to me and many other players. It's a game that just makes you want to get lost and explore every inch of the map. And now that almost every wall or mountainside is climbable, That feeling of curiosity is even enhanced. If you want to know what's on top of a mountain, there is nothing stopping you from just literally climbing it. And almost every time you are rewarded with a shrine or Korok seed or something else. The first mountain I climbed, I was greeted by a freaking dragon. And now that everything is so open, the game makes it so much easier to explore. Once you're done with one thing, another thing catches your eye. Maybe you will see a shrine off in the distance that you can paraglide to, or an enemy camp at the base of the hill you didn't see at first. This open air gameplay and having the freedom to climb anything and everything changed, at least for me, the way open world games should be designed, and is too big of an accomplishment to not bring back in the next game in the series. Shrines were a fantastic way to keep the player engaged throughout the entire game when they weren't playing through the main story and quests. Hell, I think the shrines were the best part of the game. They were so different from one another that they always felt like a brand new experience. Besides the combat trials, those got pretty dull at some point. But I still had fun with combat, and to me the shrines were much more similar to your typical Zelda dungeons rather than the Divine Beasts. They had puzzles, some combat, light exploration. Most of them were extremely fun to play through, and I had a blast trying to find them all. But to me, they did have a problem, and not the shrines particularly, but something the shrines kind of caused. Now, like I said earlier, whenever you complete a shrine, you get a shrine orb. 4 shrine orbs, and you can trade that in for another heart container or more stamina to add to your stamina wheel. Sounds great. It was, but it kinda screwed up rewards for doing other stuff such as side missions. What else can they give you since there were a finite number of shrine orbs one can receive? And again, like I said earlier, they reward you usually with some rupees or maybe a weapon. Now, since weapons are breakable, it doesn't mean as much because it could just be gone in 10 minutes. So unless the side quests really intrigued me, I never went out of my way to do them because the shrines were so much more fun to complete, and I actually got a good reward. I like to think that whenever someone does something in a game, they are expecting to be rewarded. So if a reward sucks or is gone in 10 minutes from receiving it, many players won't want to do them. Shrines were a fantastic idea and I believe should be a recurring aspect in Zelda games from now on, but Nintendo needs to find a way to find some good rewards to give players for completing other quests. Now this might be a little controversial to some people, but I believe cooking was a great addition to the Zelda series. I know some people's argument against it was that sometimes you would just mindlessly cook 1,000 mushrooms and would get a little boring. And I could agree with that to a point. Yes, cooking 1 billion mushrooms can get boring, but it's better than mindlessly cutting bushes for hearts. Also, if that's all you're cooking, then you're doing it wrong. It's such an improvement from past Zelda games on how you can get your health back. Exploration is basically the main hook of the game. When exploring, you run across plenty of things to collect and animals to hunt that can be cooked for more hearts. And some of these collectibles even have extra benefits such as boosted defense or speed. So stockpiling health should never be a problem because you run across so many different items or enemies that can be used as food. Maybe if they expand cooking in the next game with a recipe book or more effects, some people will enjoy it just like I did. Lastly, I want to talk about what should come back from previous Zelda games, and sure enough, I think you can guess what is going to be first on here. The traditional Zelda dungeons are too important to the franchise to not return. They are a staple for the series. Dungeons are what separate Zelda games from every other open world game. Every Zelda game I play, the most exciting and best designed aspect of the game are the dungeons. Sure, there have been plenty of dungeons that are dull, but most of the dungeons I have played are fun and brilliant. They always had the best puzzles and intriguing architecture to look at and explore. Maybe this is my Zelda bias coming into effect, but dungeons were my favorite part of each game. Nintendo does such a fantastic job of building these dungeons with such creativity, and I felt like that was what was really missing from the Divine Beast. Creativity, at least from the interior of the Divine Beast. And they need to not be so afraid of any linear experiences. I know they were trying to get as far away from linear stuff as much as possible, but just because something is open doesn't mean it was very good. The infamous water temple from Ocarina is one of the most hated ones I see, and that was probably the most open dungeon with multiple paths to explore. Maybe they can mix it up a bit with some linear and some more open, but the traditional Zelda dungeons need to make their way back into the series. The way Breath of the Wild introduced their items was brilliant. No more backtracking because you can solve everything in the entire game with what you receive in the first couple hours. Except there was really only 4 items you could use: Bombs, Stasis, Magnesis, and Cryonis. These were all great, but I still had an itch for some more of a variety. Not only for some of the traditional Zelda items, but maybe even some new ones. I get that this game was all about changing up the regular Zelda formula, but sometimes the Zelda formula was great. I understand it would be difficult to design an open world game where you can solve everything from the start when you have more than 4 items, but it would be wonderful to have some of my good old friends back like the hookshot. I know this is a little early to say, but I am extremely excited for the next Zelda game. I believe the next one we will see will probably be a 2D game because we usually get a smaller experience between giant 3D ones, but we could be not too far off from a next 3D Zelda title. I mean, they created this huge new engine that could be utilized in another title, just like what they did in Majora's Mask. I doubt we would see a full-on map and everything like we saw in Breath of the Wild, but hopefully we could see some new and fascinating ideas from Nintendo, just like we saw in Majora's. But if the next 3D Zelda game isn't like that and is going to be developed for another 5 or 6 years, then I hope they take some of these ideas into consideration, because I am not the only one with these concerns. If you liked or didn't like some of these ideas, then let me know in the comments section what your own thoughts on the next Zelda game. What should be introduced or whatever you are thinking. I'll see you next time.